The phone rang at exactly 7 a.m., slicing through the silence of our morning coffee. I didn't rush to answer it, taking a deliberate, slow sip from my mug before lifting the receiver. It was Varity, our daughter, and her voice was pitched high, vibrating with a frantic sort of triumph. "Dad, Mom, listen closely because I'm only saying this once," she started, breathless and sharp. "I'm getting married tomorrow to Thaddius, and we needed a fresh start, so I made a decision." She paused for dramatic effect, expecting a gasp, but I just watched the steam rise from my coffee. "I've used the power of attorney," she continued, her voice hardening. "I emptied your savings accounts this morning, and the house sale just finalized. You have 3 days to vacate. Goodbye. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories." The line went dead, leaving a silence in the kitchen that felt heavy, but not frightening. I placed the receiver back on the cradle with a steady hand, checking my watch. My wife, Aera, looked at me across the granite island, her eyes sharp, clear, and unblinking. "She thinks she's checkmated us," I said calmly, my voice void of the panic Varity had likely hoped for. Aera didn't cry or scream. She simply buttered her toast with surgical precision. Varity had made a bold, aggressive move, assuming that 60 years of life had made us soft. But there was one critical, devastating detail about this house that our daughter had completely overlooked. I walked to the study, not to panic, but to verify the extent of the damage. At my age, running is reserved strictly for fires or free scotch. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk, the wood cool under my palms, and logged into our primary bank account. The balance stared back at me. Zero, down to the very last cent, a perfect hollow circle. It takes a special kind of talent to clear out 40 years of savings before most people have brushed their teeth. I almost admired the efficiency. Varity always did have a flair for the dramatic, likely inherited from her grandmother, though I'd never admit that within earshot of Aera. I clicked through the transaction history, scrolling past the utility bills to see the massive transfers executed at 4:15 a.m. Thaddius was behind this, no doubt. A man who shook hands like he was holding a wet fish and wore sunglasses indoors to hide eyes that were constantly darting toward the exits. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking comfortably, a sound I've known for 2 decades. Most men would be clutching their chests right now, frantically searching for their nitroglycerin or dialing a lawyer with trembling fingers. But I just felt a dry, scratching irritation, like a pebble in a shoe you can't quite reach but refuse to limp for. I remembered signing that power of attorney 5 years ago before minor surgery, a just-in-case measure that had now become a loaded weapon. "Well?" Aera asked from the doorway, holding a fresh mug of black coffee, her eyebrow raised in that silent, piercing question she does so well. "Cleaned out," I replied, taking the coffee without spilling a drop. She didn't even leave enough for the valet. Aera didn't flinch. She just walked to the window and adjusted the blinds, letting in a sliver of harsh morning light. "The realtor will be here soon," she noted, her voice as level as a carpenter's level. "They thought they had us cornered, trapped in a house that supposedly wasn't ours anymore, expecting us to fold like cheap lawn chairs. But they forgot that I read the fine print on everything, from insurance policies to the back of cereal boxes." I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, locked not with a key, but with a complex combination I memorized in 1985. The doorbell rang again, an impatient, staccato burst that suggested the person on the other side thought we were deaf rather than just discerning about our visitors. I took a moment to straighten my cuffs. Presentation matters, especially when you're about to be insulted, and walked down the hallway at a pace I call retired executive leisure. Through the frosted glass, I could see a silhouette shifting back and forth, checking a wristwatch that probably cost more than my first car. I opened the door to find a young man in a navy suit so tight I genuinely worried that a deep breath would send a button flying into my eye like a projectile. He held a clipboard like a shield and offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a shark in Italian loafers. "Mr. Vance," he chirped, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his own self-importance. "I'm Julian from the agency. Your daughter, Varity, said you might be resistant." I looked at him, then slowly shifted my gaze past his shoulder to his sedan, which was parked with one wheel aggressively crushing my prize-winning hydrangeas. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice low and smooth, "you're parking on a botanical experiment that requires more care than your haircut." He blinked, completely thrown off his script, his mouth opening and closing like a goldfish dropped on a carpet. Recovering his composure, he thrust a thick envelope toward my chest. "This is the formal eviction notice. The new owners want possession in 72 hours. Vacant. Broom clean." I took the envelope, holding it by the very corner as if it were a used tissue I needed to dispose of. "Broom clean," I repeated, tasting the absurdity of the words while looking him dead in the eye. Does that include the dust in the attic? Or is that considered a historic fixture by now? Julian didn't laugh. He puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating to a man who once negotiated union contracts while suffering from a kidney stone. "Don't make this ugly, sir," he warned, shifting his weight awkwardly. "The police can remove you if necessary." I smiled then, not a nice smile, but the kind that makes people check if their wallet is still in their pocket. "Ugly is a matter of perspective, Julian," I said, stepping back and beginning to close the door. "And you have no idea what ugly looks like yet." He jammed his foot in the doorframe, a rookie mistake, and his eyes narrowed with the arrogance of someone who thinks the law is always on the side of the paperwork. "Read the addendum on page 4, old man," he sneered, dropping the polite act entirely. "Varity signed everything. You don't even own the light bulbs anymore." I glanced down at his polished shoe wedged in the door jamb, a piece of Italian leather completely unsuited for a man who didn't understand the physics of leverage. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft, "I suggest you remove that limb before I decide to close this door with the same enthusiasm my daughter closed her heart." He hesitated, his eyes darting between my face and the heavy oak door, calculating the risk, before finally snatching his foot back as if the threshold were made of hot coals. I closed the door with a firm, deliberate click, locking the deadbolt not because I was afraid of him, but because I disliked drafts and rude interruptions in equal measure. Returning to the kitchen, I tossed the eviction notice onto the counter, where it landed next to the fruit bowl with an offensive thud. Aera picked it up, putting on her reading glasses with a slow, elegant motion that always reminds me of a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. She listed the inventory, Aera murmured, scanning the pages, her finger tracing the lines of our life that had been reduced to price tags. I looked over her shoulder and let out a short, dry laugh. Varity had priced my entire collection of first edition history books at $50, classifying them as old paperbacks. "The girl doesn't know a hardback from a ham sandwich," I muttered, feeling a sting of annoyance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with her lack of taste. "It gets better," Aera said, her voice dropping a few degrees. "She's categorized your workbench tools as scrap metal and my grandmother's piano as heavy furniture, needs removal." It was a surgical dismantling of our identity, executed by someone who had eaten at this table every Sunday for 30 years. I poured myself another cup of coffee, my third, which my doctor would disapprove of, but he wasn't currently being evicted by his own offspring, and walked to the window. Outside, Julian was on his phone, pacing aggressively near the hydrangeas again, waving his arms like he was trying to guide a plane into a landing. "She wants to erase us, Aera," I said, watching the young man kick a stray pebble. "This isn't just about cash. She wants to scrub the slate clean so she doesn't have to look at the people she betrayed." I turned back to my wife, who was now staring at the wall where we marked Verity's height with a pencil as she grew. "She forgot one thing," Aera said, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that meant war. "She forgot that this house has secrets I finished for her, and she never stayed still long enough to learn where the skeletons are buried." Julian suddenly stopped pacing and hammered a for sale sign into the lawn, right through the center of my irrigation line. I watched a geyser of muddy water erupt from the lawn, spraying a fine mist over Julian's impeccably waxed sedan and soaking the legs of his trousers. He shrieked. There is no other word for it, a high-pitched sound that belonged in a horror movie, not a suburban driveway, and jumped back, slipping on the wet grass and nearly performing a split that his anatomy was definitely not designed for. I didn't rush. I walked to the mudroom and put on my old rubber galoshes because while dignity is important, dry socks are essential for maintaining a strategic advantage. By the time I stepped onto the porch, half the neighborhood was peering through their curtains, including Mrs. Higgins next door, whose hearing aid is usually turned off, but who somehow detects social disaster with the accuracy of a radar system. I walked past Julian, who was now frantically trying to wipe mud off his Italian loafers with a silk handkerchief, looking like a raccoon washing its food in a stream. "You did this," he sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at me, his face turning a shade of purple that clashed violently with his tie. "You booby-trapped the yard. Varity said you were unstable." I ignored him, walked to the main valve box concealed under a fake rock. A rock I've always thought looked ridiculous, but Aera insisted blended in, and twisted the handle, silencing the hiss of escaping water. The silence that followed was louder than the noise. I stood there, feeling the weight of Mrs. Higgins' judgment from across the fence, the for sale sign leaning drunkenly in the mud like a tombstone for our reputation. It wasn't just a broken pipe. It was a public declaration of our obsolescence, a billboard telling the world that the people inside were finished, packed up, and ready for the landfill. I looked at the hole in the ground, calculating the repair cost out of habit before remembering that technically, I wasn't allowed to fix someone else's property. "I didn't trap the yard, son," I said, wiping a speck of dirt from my shirt. "You just try to stake a claim on land that rejects you." Julian straightened up, trying to regain authority despite looking like he'd been in a water balloon fight, and pulled a phone from his pocket. "I'm documenting this destruction," he hissed, snapping photos of the mud. "And I'm calling the locksmith. We're moving the timeline up. Tomorrow morning. Locks change at 8 a.m. I felt a sharp pain in my lower back, a reminder that I'm not 30 anymore, but I forced my spine straight, refusing to wince in front of this amateur invader. I looked at the house, my house, and realized Varity hadn't just stolen our money. She had stolen our narrative, painting us as senile vandals to justify her greed. Julian dialed a number, his voice loud and vindictive, but he didn't notice the black car that had just pulled up silently behind his soaking wet sedan. The driver's door of the black sedan opened, and out stepped Thaddius, wearing sunglasses that were far too dark for a day that was currently threatening rain. He stood by the curb, inspecting the muddy disaster zone of my lawn with the sneer of a man who has never held a shovel in his life and thinks dirt is a personal insult. I stood my ground on the porch, conscious that I was wearing bright yellow rubber boots with my pressed slacks, a fashion statement that screamed confused fisherman, but I refused to look away or adjust my attire. Julian, still dripping wet and looking like a rejected damp spaniel, scrambled over to Thaddius, gesturing wildly at the pipe and then at me, clearly trying to spin his incompetence as my sabotage. Thaddius didn't even look at him. He just raised a hand to silence the boy and turned his covered eyes toward the house, toward me. "Varity is in the car," Thaddius shouted across the lawn, his voice carrying that nasal, condescending quality that makes you want to check if you still have your wallet. "She says she can't bear to see you like this," he continued, adjusting his cuffs. "It's too painful for her to watch you struggle with reality." I felt a cold, hollow thud in my chest, a sensation entirely different from anger. It was the sickening realization that my daughter wasn't just greedy, she was a coward hiding behind tinted glass. I looked at the passenger window of the black car, completely opaque, and imagined her sitting there, checking her makeup, scrolling through her phone, erasing us while sitting 50 feet away. "Tell her," I called back, my voice steady despite the tremor in my gut, "that the only thing struggling here is Julian's ability to park a car." Thaddius didn't laugh. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and covered his nose, as if the scent of wet earth and betrayal was too pungent for his delicate constitution. "The dumpster arrives at noon tomorrow," he announced, checking his watch as if he had a board meeting to attend on Mars. "Anything inside the house after that time will be treated as refuse. Family photos, clothes, that old chair you love, it's all trash, Arthur." He used my first name. He hadn't earned the right to use my first name. He hadn't even earned the right to speak to my cat, if I had one. He got back into the car without waiting for a response. The engine purred to life, and they drove off, leaving Julian to squelch his way back to his own vehicle. I turned and walked back into the house, closing the doors softly, feeling the silence of the hallway wrap around me like a suffocating blanket. For the first time all day, I felt old. Not the wise, experienced kind of old, but the heavy, tired kind where the furniture feels too big and the future feels too short. I walked into the living room and saw Aera standing by the fireplace, her back to me, staring at the empty spot where Verity's graduation picture used to hang. She wasn't crying, but her shoulders were drawn in tight, a fortress against the world, and I knew that Thaddius's words had hit her harder than any eviction notice ever could. I walked over to place a hand on her shoulder, but she turned around sharply, holding something small and metallic in her hand that I hadn't seen in 20 years. I squinted at the object in her hand, patting my shirt pocket and then my trousers in that frantic, rhythmic dance every man over 60 knows, the Macarena of lost items. I can't see a thing, Aera, I confessed, feeling foolish while the world around us was collapsing. Did I leave my glasses in the garage when I was pretending to organize the screws? Aera didn't sigh, though she had every right to. She simply pointed a manicured finger at the top of my head, where my spectacles were resting comfortably in my thinning hair. I slid them down my nose, muttering a quick apology to my own dignity, and focused on the small, tarnished brass key resting in her palm. It wasn't a house key, and it certainly wasn't the key to the safety deposit box Varity had already raided. It was the key to the red box, a heavy, fireproof container we had buried under the floorboards of the pantry during the Y2K panic of 1999. I thought we lost this when we replaced the linoleum, I whispered, the realization hitting me harder than the whiskey I suddenly craved. I didn't lose it, Arthur, Aera said, her voice dropping to a register that usually signals danger for anyone foolish enough to cross her. I moved it, because I always knew that one day, Varity would stop asking for help and start taking it. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty hallway. My wife had anticipated this betrayal while I was still teaching our daughter how to ride a bike. I looked at the boxes we were supposed to be filling, the trash Thaddius had condemned, and then back at Aera, whose posture had shifted from grief to that of a hunter sighting prey. My knees gave a loud, treacherous pop as I sat down on the ottoman, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. But for once, I didn't care about the creaks in my chassis. She thinks she sold the house. Arthur, Aera continued, closing her fist around the key until her knuckles turned white. She thinks she transferred the title, the land, and the legacy with a few electronic signatures. I watched her walk to the kitchen, her hips swaying not with age, but with a terrifying purpose. I realized then that for the last 24 hours, I had been trying to negotiate a peace treaty, while my wife had been quietly loading the artillery. I am the shield of this family, the one who takes the insults and the mud, but Aera is the sword. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a brief moment, listening to the sound of a floorboard being pried up in the pantry. Let Varity have her victory lap. Let Thaddius wear his sunglasses in the rain. They were about to learn that you never, ever declare war on a woman who remembers exactly where the bodies are buried. As the sound of rusty hinges creaking open echoed from the kitchen, I knew the defense was over. The counterattack had just begun.
I watched Arthur lower himself onto the ottoman with that familiar grimace, his knees popping like dry twigs in a campfire, and I felt a surge of affection mixed with irritation. The man tries to carry the world on his back, but he forgets he can barely carry the groceries without groaning. He thinks he is the strategist of this family because he reads military history books and watches documentaries about submarines, but he has always been the shield, thick, sturdy, and meant to take the blows, while I have always been the knife hidden in the boot. I walked into the pantry, the smell of dried oregano and old dust greeting me like an old friend, and shoved aside the 50-pound bag of dog food we bought on sale, despite the fact that our dog, Barnaby, passed away 3 years ago. We just never had the heart to throw it out. Kneeling down on the cold linoleum was easy enough, though I knew getting back up would require a crane, a prayer, or Arthur pulling me up by my armpits like a toddler. I jammed a butter knife into the crack between the floorboards, chipping my manicure, a soft rose shade I had applied just yesterday, and I mentally added the cost of a new manicure to the bill Varity was going to pay. Aera, do you need the flashlight? Arthur called out from the living room, his voice laced with that helpful anxiety that usually results in him shining a light directly into my eyes and blinding me. I need silence, Arthur, and perhaps a glass of Chardonnay, I muttered to myself, prying the board loose with a groan of protesting with that echoed the ache in my own lower back. Underneath lay the red box, covered in a layer of grime that looked like gray velvet, sitting exactly where I had placed it the year Varity turned 18, and I realized she had her father's smile, but a shark's appetite. I hauled the metal box out, its weight surprising me. It felt heavier than I remembered, burdened with 20 years of legal contingencies, and blew the dust off, choking slightly as a cloud of gray powder settled on my glasses. "Arthur," I called out, wiping my spectacles on my apron and leaving a streak of flour across the lens. "Stop looking for your reading glasses on your head. They're on the coffee table next to that eviction notice." I opened the lid, the hinges screeching in protest, and stared at the documents inside, papers that were yellowing at the edges, but legally bulletproof. Verity thought she was playing chess, but she didn't realize she was playing on a board I had designed, constructed, and rigged with explosives 2 decades ago. I picked up the document titled the 1998 Irrevocable Family Trust, feeling the cool, crisp paper between my fingers. She had sold the house using a power of attorney that granted her rights over our personal assets, completely missing the fact that this house hasn't been a personal asset since the Clinton administration. I sat there on the pantry floor, surrounded by cans of soup and memories, and let out a laugh that sounded jagged and dark. She hadn't just sold her home, she had unknowingly sold property she didn't own to a buyer who expected a clean title, committing 3 different types of fraud before breakfast. I was about to call Arthur in to show him the weapon, but then I heard the back door handle rattle slowly, quietly, like someone trying to enter without waking the dead. I froze, my hand hovering over the cold metal of the lockbox, listening to the handle of the back door being jiggled with the clumsy persistence of a raccoon trying to get into a trash can. Whoever was on the other side clearly assumed that 2 60-year-olds would be napping in their armchairs with the TV volume set to jet engine, completely oblivious to a mid-afternoon break-in. I shoved the heavy metal box behind a 20-pound sack of basmati rice we panic-bought 3 years ago during a supply chain scare and will likely be eating until the day we die, and prepared for the logistical operation of standing up. It involved a strategic grab of the pantry shelf, a deeply unladylike grunt, and a series of joint pops that sounded like a string of firecrackers going off in a canyon, but I made it to my feet with my dignity mostly intact. I didn't reach for a phone to call 911. I reached for the cast-iron skillet drying on the rack, a 12-inch seasoned weapon of mass destruction that has seared steaks and could certainly sear a conscience. Walking to the back door, I watched the lock turn slowly. They had a key, likely a copy Varity had given them for emergencies, and I waited, counting down from 3 with the patience of a sniper. The door swung open and Thaddius stepped into my kitchen, wearing his ridiculous sunglasses inside and carrying a laser measuring tape, looking like a low-budget secret agent who had gotten lost on the way to a villain's lair. He screamed when he saw me standing 2 feet away, dropping his laser tool which skittered across the floor and under the refrigerator, likely joining the graveyard of ice cubes and cat toys. "Jesus, Aera," he gasped, clutching his chest in a display of fragility that I found deeply satisfying. "You almost gave me a heart attack. Why are you standing in the dark holding a frying pan?" "I'm contemplating making an omelet, Thaddius," I said, my voice dead flat, tapping the heavy iron against my palm. "Or perhaps tenderizing some very tough, very cheap meat." He took a step back, his eyes darting to the pantry door I had just closed, and I saw a bead of sweat trickle down his temple that had nothing to do with the temperature. I came to measure the kitchen for the renovation," he stammered, recovering his arrogance, but not his composure. "The new buyers want to rip all this out. Open concept. This layout is ancient." Arthur chose that moment to burst into the room from the hallway, wielding a shoehorn like a dagger and looking wild-eyed, his reading glasses now crookedly perched on the very tip of his nose. "I heard a noise," Arthur announced, brandishing the shoehorn at Thaddius. "State your business, or I will. I will assist you out of here with extreme prejudice." I lowered the pan, suppressing a smile. My husband looked ridiculous, but he also looked ready to die for me, and that counts for everything. "He's measuring, Arthur," I said calmly, fixing Thaddius with a look that dared him to move. "He thinks he's going to tear down this kitchen." Thaddius sneered, regaining his footing now that the initial shock had passed. It's not what I think, Alara. It's what's happening. And if you're hiding anything of value jewelry, cash, bonds, you better hand it over. The audit covers everything. He wasn't just here to measure, he was fishing. The bank must have asked for the original deed, or the title company had hit a snag, and he was looking for the paper trail before the system flagged his fraud. The only thing of value in this kitchen, Thaddius, I said, stepping closer until I could smell his expensive, cloying cologne, is the lesson you are about to learn. He turned to leave, flustered and angry, but as he grabbed the doorknob, his phone buzzed loudly in his pocket with a specific ringtone. It was Varity, and even from here, I could hear her screaming through the speaker. Thaddius didn't offer a polite farewell. He simply vanished, the screen door slamming against his heels as Verity's voice continued to screech from his pocket like a demon trapped in a cell phone. Arthur was still vibrating with combat readiness in the middle of the kitchen, gripping his shoehorn with white-knuckled intensity, his chest heaving under his cardigan. "I think I scared him, Alara," he declared, adjusting his glasses, which were now hanging precariously off one ear. "Did you see his eyes?" He knew I was aiming for the kneecaps. "Take out the mobility and the enemy crumbles." "Yes, dear, he was terrified," I said, gently prying the shoehorn from his grip before he accidentally pulled a rotator cuff or broke the ceiling fan. Although next time, perhaps grab the rolling pin. It has better range. Arthur looked at the shoehorn, then at me, and blinked, the adrenaline suddenly dumping him back into reality. Right. Rolling pin. Good note. Is there any of that coffee cake left? Defending the castle makes me terribly peckish. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence settling around us again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of victims anymore. It was the focused quiet of a war room. I spread the documents from the red box across the table, smoothing out the creases of the thick, cream-colored bond paper that smelled faintly of old legal offices and 1998. Arthur chewed his coffee cake thoughtfully, crumbs falling onto his sweater, vestiges of a battle he didn't quite understand yet, and peered at the bold header I was pointing to. "The Vance Family Heritage Trust," he read aloud, squinting. "I remember this. The lawyer said it was to avoid probate taxes. I thought it was just paperwork." "It was paperwork, Arthur, but it was specific paperwork," I explained, tapping the paragraph I had highlighted in yellow 20 years ago. "Verity used a power of attorney to sell our assets," I continued, my voice steady. "But this house isn't our asset. We don't own it. The trust owns it. And the power of attorney she forced you to sign explicitly excludes trust administration." Arthur stopped chewing, a piece of walnut visible at the corner of his mouth. "So, she didn't sell the house?" "She sold a house she didn't have the legal right to sell," I corrected him, feeling a cold, hard satisfaction that was tinged with a mother's grief. "She signed a deed as an individual seller for a property owned by a corporation. The moment that sale is recorded, she commits title fraud." Arthur swallowed hard, the reality sinking in. His eyes lost that spark of combat and darkened with a heavy, paternal sorrow. "And the money she took from the accounts?" he asked quietly. "Those accounts were linked to the trust to pay for property taxes," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms. "She didn't just steal from her parents, Arthur. She embezzled from a legal entity. That's not a family dispute. That's a federal crime with a mandatory minimum sentence." We sat there, two old people in a kitchen that was supposed to be demolished, realizing that our daughter hadn't just tried to evict us. She had inadvertently handcuffed herself. "She's going to go to prison," Arthur whispered, looking at his hands. "Our little girl is going to prison." "Not necessarily," I said, standing up and walking to the window where the rain had started to fall, washing away Julian's footprints. I wasn't going to send her to prison. That would be too easy, too final. I was going to do something much worse. I was going to let her think she had won for exactly 12 more hours, let her spend the money, let her brag to her friends, and let her dig the hole so deep she could never climb out without our ladder. My phone rang then, not the house phone, but my personal cell, and the caller ID showed the bank. But it wasn't our local branch. It was the fraud department, and they sounded very, very confused. I held the phone to my ear, listening to Mr. Sterling from the bank's high net worth fraud division apologize for the fourth time, his voice trembling slightly as he realized the magnitude of the error his institution had facilitated. Mrs. Vance, if what you're saying about the trust structure is true, and I'm looking at the 1998 filings now, then the transfer your daughter initiated this morning is void, he stammered, the sound of furious typing echoing in the background. Arthur was attempting to be helpful by securing the perimeter, which involved him pacing back and forth in front of the bay window, holding a heavy brass candlestick like a baton and squinting suspiciously at a squirrel that had dared to venture onto the porch. "She's coming, Alara," he hissed, ducking below the windowsill with a groan that sounded like a rusty hinge. "The eagle has landed, and she looks absolutely furious. Also, she's parking on the grass again, right next to the for sale sign she knocked over yesterday." I ignored the gardening report and focused on Mr. Sterling. "I don't want you to cancel the transaction yet, Mr. Sterling. I want you to flag it as pending investigation and freeze the destination account. Let her see the money in her balance, but make sure she can't buy so much as a pack of gum with it." "That is highly irregular, Mrs. Vance," the banker replied, clearly terrified of saying no to me. "So is elder abuse, Mr. Sterling," I countered, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Do it. Or I call the regulators." I hung up just as the front door flew open. Varity didn't knock, of course. She simply barged in, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of expensive, nervous sweat with her. She looked manic, her hair slightly frizzy, clutching a bridal planner in one hand and a set of keys in the other. "Why is the furniture still here?" she shrieked, ignoring her father, who had popped up from behind the sofa, still holding the candlestick and wearing his reading glasses over his regular glasses, giving him the appearance of a very confused doll. "We have a walkthrough in an hour. Thaddius is bringing the investors. This place needs to look like a blank canvas, not a nursing home." Arthur straightened up, trying to look imposing, but realized he still had a paper napkin tucked into his collar from his coffee cake snack. He ripped it out with dignity, crumpled it, and pointed the candlestick at her. "You do not yell in this house, young lady," Arthur announced, his voice booming with a surprising authority, though he ruined the effect slightly by adding, "and you owe me for a sprinkler head." Varity rolled her eyes, a gesture so juvenile it made my palm itch. "Dad, put down the candlestick before you hurt yourself. You're pathetic. Both of you. I'm trying to help you move on, and you're digging your heels in like toddlers." I sat at the dining table, my hands folded over the trust documents, watching her. This was it. The final off-ramp. The last chance for her to look at us and see parents, not ATMs. "Varity," I said softly, the room falling silent. "Stop. Sit down. Have some tea. Tell us you're in trouble. Tell us Thaddius put you up to this. We can fix it if you stop right now." She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the daughter I used to braid hair for uncertain, scared. But then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, saw the fake balance in her account, and the greed glazed over her eyes like frost. "I don't need your tea, and I don't need your help," she sneered, stepping closer. "I have the money. I have the power. You're guests in my house, and your lease has expired. Get out, or I call the sheriff myself." Arthur gasped, looking at me with wide, hurt eyes, waiting for my signal. She had made her choice. She had chosen the money over the blood. "Guests," I repeated, tasting the word. "Very well," I stood up, my joints aching, but my resolve harder than diamond. "Call the sheriff, Varity. In fact, put him on speaker. I think he'll be very interested in what Arthur found in the basement." Varity hesitated, the phone halfway to her ear. "What? What's in the basement?" "Nothing," I lied smoothly, smiling a shark smile. "Just the history you forgot to burn." Arthur, bless him, caught the cue immediately, though he had no idea what I was talking about. "Yes," he shouted, pointing a finger at her. "The basement. The things. We have them. And they are very dusty." Verity's confidence wavered for the first time, her eyes starting between us, sensing a trap but unable to see the teeth. Varity was pacing the living room floor so frantically she was practically vibrating, her phone pressed to her ear as Thaddeus screamed loud enough for the neighbors to hear 3 states away. "What do you mean, compliance hold?" She shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of a heist gone wrong. "It's my money. I transferred it. Just override it, Thaddeus. You said you knew the manager." Arthur was still guarding the basement door, having swapped the candlestick for a heavy, marble bust of Beethoven he had retrieved from the mantel, a ridiculous weapon, considering he usually complains about its weight when dusting. But he held it over his head like a Grecian titan preparing to smite a mortal. "Elara," Arthur whispered loudly, leaning toward me while keeping one eye on our daughter. "My deltoids are beginning to burn. How much longer must I threaten her with the composer? He's heavier than he looks." "Hold the line, Arthur," I murmured, taking a slow, calm sip of my tea. "The longer she panics, the more mistakes she makes. Just try not to drop Ludwig on your toes. We don't have coverage for self-inflicted art injuries." Varity finally threw the phone onto the sofa, where it bounced harmlessly, and turned to us, her face a mask of twisted confusion and dawning horror. "You did this," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You called the bank. You froze the accounts. You're trying to ruin my wedding." "I'm trying to keep you out of a federal penitentiary, Varity," I replied, my voice cool and even, watching her unravel. "Though I admit, the orange jumpsuit would clash terribly with your complexion." She didn't have time to respond because the front door banged open again, and this time, Thaddeus didn't walk in alone. He was flanked by 2 men who looked less like real estate investors and more like refrigerators with legs, wearing suits that strained at the seams. "Enough talk." Thaddeus roared, his fig tan looking blotchy with rage. "The wire is stuck, but the deed is signed. This is my house. Get these squatters out now." Arthur stepped forward, brandishing the bust of Beethoven with surprising agility for a man who groans when he stands up from the toilet. "Stay back," Arthur warned, his voice shaking slightly but his eyes fierce. "I have a heavy classical musician, and I'm not afraid to use him. This is private property." One of the investors stepped forward, a towering wall of muscle, and simply shoved Arthur aside. My husband stumbled, his feet tangling in the antique rug, and he went down hard, the marble bust thumping dully onto the carpet next to him. Arthur let out a sharp gasp, not of fear, but of pain, clutching his hip, the hip he's been babying for 3 years. Time seemed to freeze. The sound of Arthur hitting the floor was the loudest noise I have ever heard. Something inside me, something ancient and terrible that I keep locked away behind manners and cookie recipes, snapped. I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't scream. I walked over to the investor who had touched my husband, moving into his personal space until I was looking up at his chin. "You have made a miscalculation," I said, my voice so low it was almost a whisper, but it carried enough chill to freeze the room. "You think because we are old, we are weak. You think because we move slowly, we are prey." I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the one thing I had retrieved from the red box that wasn't a document, a small, black remote control for the silent alarm system we installed in 1995, a system directly hardwired to the private security firm that protects the senator down the street. "I pressed this 5 minutes ago," I lied. I had actually pressed it when Arthur fell, but fear works best when it's retroactive. Thaddeus laughed, a nervous, barking sound. "Bluffs. All bluffs. Grab the woman too." The large man reached for my arm, his fingers brushing the fabric of my sweater. I didn't flinch. I stared into his eyes and smiled, a smile that promised absolute ruin. "Touch me," I dared him, "and you will spend the rest of your life explaining to a judge why you assaulted a senior citizen in a house you are actively burglarizing." He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. And in that silence, we heard it. Not a siren, but the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter growing louder directly above the house, shaking the crystal in the cabinet. The investors looked at the ceiling, then at Thaddeus. "You said this was a quiet eviction," the big man growled, backing away from me. "It is." Thaddeus squeaked, looking at the vibrating window panes. "It's just heavy traffic." Arthur groaned from the floor, trying to sit up. Alara, did you call the Air Force? No, dear, I said, smoothing my skirt. But I think I know who did. The sound of the helicopter blades chopping the air above us was so intense that the crystal chandelier in the foyer began to chime, a delicate, tinkling protest against the chaos unfolding below. I watched the blood drain from the faces of Thaddius's investors, the two mountains of muscle who had, just seconds ago, seemed ready to dismantle my husband like a piece of IKEA furniture. They were professionals in their own sordid way, and they knew the difference between a neighborhood noise complaint and a tactical response. They exchanged a single, grin look, the kind that says this paycheck isn't worth the prison time, and immediately backed away from Arthur. We're done here, the larger one grunted, smoothing his lapels as if he hadn't just assaulted a retiree. You didn't say anything about heat like this, Thaddius. We're out. Thaddius sputtered, looking like a damp napkin trying to hold back a flood. You can't leave. I'm paying you. Finish them. You're paying us with money you don't have, for a house you don't own. The man sneered, stepping over Arthur's legs with surprising delicacy. Good luck with the feds, kid. They bolted out the back door, leaving it swinging on its hinges, just as the blue and red lights began to flash through the front bay window, painting the living room in a strobing disco of justice. I knelt down beside Arthur, who was still on the floor, rubbing his hip but looking remarkably pleased with himself, like a man who had just won a game of solitaire he'd been cheating at. Are you broken, Arthur? I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I am merely structurally compromised, Arthur wheezed, adjusting his glasses, which were now sitting at a 45-degree angle on his face. But Alara, look at this view. I found that missing puzzle piece from the 2018 landscape set under the sofa. It's a cloud. I knew it was a cloud. I let out a short, choked laugh, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. You are impossible, old man. Stay down. The cavalry is here. Varity was standing in the center of the room, spinning in a slow circle, watching her future evaporate. She looked at the fleeing thugs, the flashing lights, and then at Thaddius, who was frantically trying to delete files from his phone with shaking hands. Thaddius? She whispered, her voice trembling with the first dawn of true understanding. Why are the police here? Why did those men run? I stood up, leaving Arthur to guard his puzzle piece, and walked toward my daughter, holding the final document from the red box, the one I had saved for the very end. Because, Varity, I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the siren outside, Thaddius didn't bring investors. He brought loan sharks. He owes them money, and he tried to use our house as collateral to pay off his gambling debts. Varity froze, her eyes widening as she looked at her fiancé. Is that true? Thaddius didn't answer. He just kept tapping his screen, sweat dripping onto the glass. And there's one more thing, I continued, holding up the paper. The Vance Family Heritage Trust has a bad actor clause. Section 9, paragraph C. I stepped closer, forcing her to look at the paper, to read the fine print she had been too arrogant to check. If any beneficiary attempts to defraud, embezzle, or illegally seize trust assets, they are immediately and irrevocably removed from the trust. All future inheritance is forfeited and redirected to the designated charity. The color left her face completely. She wasn't just in trouble, she was disinherited. By her own hand. You can't do that, she stammered, tears finally spilling over, not for us, but for herself. I'm your daughter. I didn't do it, Varity, I said softly, feeling a terrible, heavy sadness. You did. You signed the transfer this morning. You triggered the clause. You fired yourself from this family. The front door burst open, not with a kick, but with a heavy, authoritative entrance of officers who knew exactly who they were coming for, led by Sheriff Miller, who plays poker with Arthur every second Tuesday. Thaddius Broker. Miller shouted, his voice booming. Hands where I can see them. We have a warrant for wire fraud and identity theft. Thaddius looked at the back door, then at the sheriff, and then, in a moment of pure cowardice, he pointed at Varity. It was her. He screamed, his voice cracking. She made me do it. She stole her parents' identity. I'm just the fiancé. Verity gasped, stepping back as if slept, looking at the man she was supposed to marry tomorrow, seeing him for the rat he truly was. Arthur, still on the floor, cleared his throat loudly. "Sheriff," Arthur called out, waving the puzzle piece like a badge of office. "Be careful with him, Bob. He's wearing very expensive loafers, and I suspect he cries easily." The sheriff moved in, handcuffs glinting in the strobing light, and as the metal clicked around Thaddius's wrists, I looked at Varity. She was standing alone in the middle of the room, bankrupt, betrayed by her partner, and exiled by her own greed. She looked at me, her lips trembling, waiting for me to fix it, waiting for Mom to make the bad man go away. But I just folded the document and put it back in my apron pocket. The lesson wasn't over yet. The silence that followed the slamming of the police cruiser doors was heavy, absolute, and tasted like ozone and exhaust. Thaddius was gone, dragged away shouting about his lawyers, his dignity shredding with every step, leaving behind only the faint, lingering scent of desperation and cheap cologne. Sheriff Miller, having handed Thaddius off to his deputy, walked back into the living room, removing his hat with a sigh that rattled his badge. "I'm sorry it came to this. Arthur, Aera," he said, his voice gruff with the awkwardness of witnessing family wreckage. "We've been tracking his accounts for months. He's been running Ponzi schemes in 3 counties. Varity, well, she was just his latest mark." Arthur was still on the floor, but he raised a hand with the solemn gravity of a pontiff blessing a crowd. "Bob, before you offer any more condolences, I require a tactical extraction," Arthur announced, wincing as he tried to shift his weight. "My knees have decided to lock in a position of permanent victory. I believe I am now part of the architecture." Miller chuckled, a warm, grounding sound, and reached down to hoist my husband up. Arthur rose with a series of alarming pops and cracks, clutching his puzzle piece like a recovered holy relic, dusting off his trousers with renewed dignity. "Thank you, Bob," Arthur said, straightening his cardigan. "Next poker night, the scotch is on me. Assuming I still own the scotch." "You own it," Arthur, Miller said, glancing at Varity, who was standing by the window, shivering despite the warmth of the room. "I'll leave you folks to it." When the door clicked shut, the room felt vast. Varity turned to face us, her makeup streaked, her posture collapsed. The arrogant woman who had barged in demanding keys was gone, replaced by the child who used to scrape her knees and run to me for bandages. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know about the loan sharks. I didn't know he was stealing from others. I wanted to secure our future." "No, Varity," I said, my voice soft but unyielding, refusing to bridge the distance between us. "You wanted to skip the work. You wanted the inheritance without the grief. You saw us as obstacles to your comfort, not as people." She took a step forward, reaching out a hand. "I can fix this. We can call the lawyers. I can undo the transfer." "The bank is already undoing the transfer, Varity," I replied, walking past her to the mantelpiece to straighten the photos she had threatened to throw in a dumpster. "And the trust has already acted. You triggered the clause. It's automatic. But what do I do?" she asked, tears spilling freely now, the reality of her solitude crashing down. "Thaddius is gone. The money is gone. Where do I go?" Arthur walked over to her, and for a moment, I thought he might hug her, might soften as he always does. But he stopped 3 feet away, looking at her with a sadness that was far more painful than anger. "You go and find out who you are when you aren't waiting for us to die," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly but his gaze clear. "You are 30 years old, Varity. You are smart and you are capable, but you are no longer a beneficiary of this house. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. It was the hardest thing we have ever done, to stand there, solid and gray, and watch our only child walk to the door, not with a check, but with a lesson." She paused at the threshold, looking back at the warm light of the kitchen, at the parents she had underestimated, and for the first time in years, she looked respectful. "Goodbye, Mom." "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. "Goodbye, Varity," I said. "Drive safe. And don't park on the grass on your way out." She left. The door closed. The lock clicked, a sound of finality, of security returned. The house was quiet. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath and sank onto the sofa, placing the cloud-shaped puzzle piece on the coffee table with immense care. "We did it, Alara," he murmured, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "We held the line. But Lord, I feel like I've gone 12 rounds with a heavyweight." I walked over and sat beside him, taking his hand. His skin was paper-thin, spotted with age, but his grip was warm and alive. "We aren't just old people, Arthur," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder, smelling the wool and the faint dust of the battle. "We are the history of this place. We are the foundation." They thought they could knock us down with a piece of paper, but they forgot that foundations are designed to bear the weight. Arthur smiled, a tired, crooked smile that I have loved for 40 years. "I suppose we should put the red box back," he said, chuckling softly. "Just in case the grandkids, if we ever get them, decide to try their luck." "Tomorrow," I said, closing my eyes, feeling the peace of our home settle around us like a warm blanket. "Tomorrow we put the box back. Tonight we finish the puzzle." "I found the cloud," Arthur noted proudly, patting my hand. "Yes, Arthur," I whispered. "You found the cloud." We sat there in the silence, two warriors resting by the fire, battered but unbroken, the masters of our own domain, while the rain outside washed the driveway clean.